very, very excited to be hosting you for this webinar. It's the second webinar that we're hosting in this series. But first of all, if you're new to Yachad, my name is Stav and I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Yachad. And our work is really about mobilizing the British Jewish community to support a resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And we do that, first of all, within the British Jewish community in events like this, and in our work with communal organizations like the Board of Deputies and the JLC, and various Jewish youth movements across the religious spectrum. And we do that through advocating for our values in Parliament. And throughout our work, we really prioritize platforming the voices of our Palestinian and Israeli partners who work day in and day out to really end occupation and bring about peace for everyone living in the region. And so that's why I'm very excited to have Dana and Physicians for Human Rights Israel here. We started this webinar series a couple of months ago, and the aim is really to, every 2 months, focus on a topical issue in Israel-Palestine and go a step beyond the headlines to receive a more in-depth briefing from one of our partners on the ground. And so last time we hosted Iramim, and we focused on settlement expansion in East Jerusalem and the flag march. And it's great, as I mentioned, to have Physicians for Human Rights with us here today. For those of you who aren't familiar with PHRI, they were established in 1988 by a group of Israeli physicians led by Dr. Ruchama Marton, and they really lead the struggle for the right to health in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. And they do that through the provision of humanitarian aid on the one hand and work promoting policy change on the other. And I think that they operate in a really unique space in this sense because they show the structural change that is needed in order to help their clients and their partner organizations. They're supported by more than 3,500 members and volunteers and serve more than 20,000 people by providing medical care or assistance each year. So they really have a wide-ranging scope of activities, which I'm sure Dana will tell us more about in a moment. Dana is the International Advocacy Coordinator for PHRI, and she has a background in conflict transformation and has worked as a researcher in think tanks worldwide. She's worked for nearly a decade in joint Palestinian-Israeli initiatives, managing programs involving different stakeholders, including youth, journalists, and human rights activists. And her work within PHRI focuses on the intersection of medical ethics and international law. She herself holds an LLB and an MPhil from the University of Oxford. So the reason that we invited PHRI, or they reached out to us to come and speak today, is because they're wrapping up a 2-year project on Palestinian women's health and how how their mental health is being impacted by the blockade in Gaza. They collaborated on this project with the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, GCMHP, which is a nonprofit civil society organization established in 1990 that works in the seam between mental health and human rights. They carry out clinical, social, research, and training services in addition to their advocacy work. And we're very grateful to PHRI for offering us this exclusive briefing about the findings of the report before it's being made public, and we'll be able to actually disseminate a copy of the executive summary of the report to everyone who came to this briefing today. And I think that this issue is especially important now because, as Dana mentioned to me before, we started this conversation, although the focus on Gaza tends to fade from the headlines outside of the various, operations that are carried out, it's important to continue to highlight the ongoing implications of the blockade every day. So a few moments of housekeeping before I hand over to Dana. She'll give us a briefing for about half an hour. We'll then open up to Q&A. So do prepare questions in advance and feel free to put them in the Q&A box below during Dana's presentation, and she'll address them in the end. And we'll aim to finish by 8. Thank you. So I will now hand over to Dana.
Thank you so much, Stav, and thank you everyone who made the time to join us here today. I'm sorry my counterpart, Dr. Abu Jama from the Gaza Mental Health Community Program couldn't be here today. Hopefully I'll be able to communicate the findings of the project we led together on behalf of him as well. But before we sort of delve into these findings, I want to share the words of one of the Palestinian women from Gaza who told us her story, which is really representative of the cumulative, interlinked, and intergenerational nature of human rights violations and trauma for Palestinian women in Gaza. I won't use her full name, just the letter of her name. T is 48. She is undergoing cancer treatment, and she is living in a refugee camp within Gaza. And I use her words. "We are used to waking up to the sounds of bombings. I saw broken glass on my sleeping children's bodies and faces several times. There is no security, and there is always anxiety or fear of what might happen next. My husband's economic status has been markedly impacted. He used to work in Israel, but now he is sick, and permits to work in Israel are being issued less frequently. As for my medical treatment, I have no money left to pay for it." T's house was partially bombed in a 2008 assault, a house that was paid for when her husband had a job and he lost his job. There's extremely high rates of unemployment in Gaza, primarily due to the blockade imposed by Israel. T and her husband and children moved in with her parents, and their house was damaged in the 2021 assault, to the extent that their neighbors could see them when they used the bathroom, and they were forced to move again. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, but because primarily of the blockade, there's a lack of oncology treatment available in Gaza. She was forced to leave Gaza for medical treatment in Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem, and then she had to undergo the whole bureaucratic procedure of getting a medical exit permit, including a security interrogation, one that involved her having to be naked, and the humiliation that's involved with that. And she spoke in her interview about this, and I want to close with her quote. "I keep thinking about this, about the possibility that I would die, that my husband would marry another woman, and that my children would be in the same situation, facing the same problems." As Stav mentioned, Gaza is largely invisible to the international community, except for during military assaults. And in the most recent one, everyone read the headlines: 33 dead, 190 injured, nearly 3,000 housing units damaged. For us as PHRI, we were also interested in the wider question of what happens in the aftermath of such assaults. And we wanted to explore both the short and the long-term impact of trauma on these women. And the joint work of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program and PHRI was to reveal the political context of the mental health crisis. And we know that mental health, does not happen in a vacuum. All of us that were there during the COVID-19 lockdowns know that, with the lockdowns, there was an interrelated spike in deterioration of mental health, particularly for adolescents. Dr. Abu Jama was telling us about how during the COVID-19 lockdowns, he was asked by colleagues, including from the UK, how are you doing? How is everything there? And he basically said, in a way that the lockdown in Gaza is not the same as the lockdown somewhere else, in that the blockade is always ongoing. But I do think there was some understanding of what it means when you're locked down for people who are living outside of Gaza and looking in. And before I sort of delve into depth into the project findings, I want to say that the blockade of Gaza is the new normal. It's been there for 16 years now, but it's not an act of God, and we can't accept it as something that's fixed. It's intentional policy by Israel. It's intentional policy and part and parcel of the Israeli government's attempt to fragment between Gaza, West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And one of the things that was very poignant to me as a mother was what these women were saying about these children who grew up under the blockade. They don't know any other life. And as parents, for those of you who are parents, we assume that the life that we would leave for our children would be better than the one that we ourselves live. And for Palestinian women in Gaza, that's not the case. These women would relate that they were asked by their children, we used to be able to travel, we used to have 24/7 electricity, and that wasn't the essence of the study, but it shows how every aspect of daily life impacts the mental health of Palestinian women. This really has an impact both on the child and on the mother. How do you tell someone who has lived the whole life in a prison that there's something beyond the prison bars? And what story do you tell about that? And so we were working during this project to answer the two main questions. First is, what is life in this prison? What human rights violations do these women suffer from? And what is the mental health impact of these human rights violations? We carried out a mixed method study on the impact of the blockade and the various Israeli human rights violations on Palestinian women in Gaza. We had a survey that was formulated and developed by mental health professionals, both Palestinian and Israeli, of over 400 adult women who attended either the Gaza Community Mental Health Program or PHRI's mobile clinics. And we carried out this program in the most marginalized areas of Gaza, so the eastern, southern, very northern tips. And during these clinics, we both provided, medical care in terms of physical medical care and also mental health trainings. And we found out, and we distributed something called the PHQ-4 test, which screens and identifies individuals who might be suffering from the mental health disorders. But we found out that in terms of the human rights violations experienced by these women, that the sort of top ones were the bombings of residential areas during Israeli assaults on Gaza. And a shocking 91.2% of the women testified that that is something that had happened to them. One of the other, very common human rights violations that these 400 plus women had suffered was an inability to access medical care because of Israeli permit restrictions. And I just want to sort of step back and explain the context of this. The most developed hospitals in the Palestinian health system are in East Jerusalem, but to exit Gaza and head to a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem, you need an Israeli medical exit permit. And according to WHO, permit rates right now are at about, acceptance rates are about at 60%. So 40% of individuals applying to access medical care in East Jerusalem don't get to go. And the ones that do get to go, the answers are received last minute. And if they're refused, it's not clear why they're being refused to. Often they're just not responded to in general. Physicians for Human Rights Israel, we ourselves assist something like 200 to 300 individuals per year whose medical exit permits are either refused or unanswered. And we assist, whether it's through writing to the Israeli authorities, reaching out primarily to the Israeli media, even pre-petitions, legal petitions. And from these 200 to 300 individuals that we assist each year, roughly a quarter are cancer patients because of the blockade in Gaza and the dual use list imposed by Israel. Certain drug cocktails are not available, certain equipment isn't available. And so when we say human rights violation of being unable to access medical care because of permit restrictions, we're also talking about someone who has had needs to undergo chemo in East Jerusalem and received a permit 5 times, but in the 6th time she was refused for a reason she doesn't know. Another aspect that we see quite a lot of, and we've assisted over 180 such cases, is that of child separation. So a situation where children need to access medical care outside of Gaza. They get a permit, but their parents do not. And that happens quite often. As I've said, we've assisted over 180 such families. It's usually the mother that requests. And we're talking about children from breastfed babies to 15, 16 years old. Obviously, and that has a mental health impact as well. I know when I say the numbers that we assist, it's only the tip of the iceberg. We take in very, very, very few cases. So first human rights violation was the bombing of residential areas. The second sort of most common is inability to access medical care because of medical exit restrictions by the Israeli authorities. Third is the loss of a family member during Israeli assaults in Gaza, and 35.6% of the women that we interviewed lost a family member. Just as an example, in 2014, during the Israeli assault, there were 551 children who were killed. So we're talking about, extensive impact on many, many, many families. And another very, very common human rights violation is 35.7% of the women testified that they lost a family member who died after they did not receive a medical exit permit from the Israeli authorities. So these are the this is the scale of the human rights violations that we hear about. And medical literature shows a very clear link between exposure to traumatic events and the development of mental health conditions. So as I mentioned, we use the PHQ-4 test, which sort of identifies individuals who are likely to develop or may be suffering psychological distress. And here we assumed that the levels would be higher, but we were struck by how common the distress was. So from the women, from the 424 women that we interviewed, 64.9% of the women showed signs of psychological distress, anxiety and depression primarily. 47.6% demonstrated signs of severe psychological distress. 80.9% of the women suffered from severe anxiety. And, when we're speaking about emotional distress, we're talking about, fear, primarily, fear of death or repeat bombings or loss of family members. And for many, this is actually rooted in something. This is rooted in seeing the damage done to the residential areas, seeing very, very distressing scenes, seeing even the death of family members or neighbors. Another sort of signifier of emotional distress was hopelessness. So as in, this is very much a typical consequence of long-term exposure to trauma. And, we see a loss of hope for the future, for a secure life, for stability, a sort of fear that something may go wrong at any moment. And there was one quote that we found that I find very, very meaningful from one of the women, which is, "I don't think we are going to survive the next war. I sometimes think about where we are going in this life. This is a continuous and sudden death." And, there's, this sort of extreme type of emotion on one hand, and then there's emotional blunting that we, consistently saw on the other, where for these women to, logically sort of distance themselves from the trauma. And the other thing that we saw a lot is, psychosomatic symptoms, which is the way in which psychological stress manifested as bodily problems, as impaired motor function. And one of the women who spoke to us said, all day long, I'm tired. In the evening, I can't get up. I can't pray. I can't cook for my children. It's as if I were drunk. And we've seen this in medical literature, whether it relates to refugees or torture victims, the way in which exposure to human rights violations is linked with the development of physical health systems. So, as an example of what we saw from our research, 38% of these women reported that they're suffering from back pains. 22.4% reported that they had generalized body pains. And I'm happy to sort of delve into this a bit later. This research specifically focused on Gaza, but I think that there's a larger question of the mental health crisis that results, and it's set in the context of Israeli human rights violations. It goes, back to the Nakba and the ongoing sort of trauma from that, to anything from house demolitions or forcible transfer, forcible home invasions, which is another report of ours that we gave a briefing to a Yachad audience a couple of years ago. And this sort of multi-generational trauma exists both within Israel, but also beyond. And I think, when we speak about this government, obviously, there's an understanding of a severe deterioration here, but this has been in our research as, in the context of previous governments as well. And it's important to sort of understand it within a context of, not coincidence, but Israeli policy. whereby you have the separation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and you have an Israeli health system and a Palestinian health system, and you have a very, very extensive Israeli control over all aspects of Palestinian life. And as a result, the difference between the Israeli and Palestinian health system is massive, both in terms of everything from number of beds to the vaccinations during the COVID-19 crisis. And you see it very much in the sort of health indices. So, infant mortality, obviously in the occupied Palestinian territory, is several times higher than that of Israel. There's less life expectancy, and this isn't something that we can say in data, but of course, if we can say that Israelis also have a trauma from the sort of ongoing occupation. This is all the more so in a very asymmetrical situation for Palestinians, particularly those living in Gaza. And I think that's pretty much it in a very lengthy nutshell. And I'm happy to answer questions. And yes, thank you again for your interest and your dedication. It's not obvious to have people attend on a 7 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. So I'm very grateful to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Dana. I think that was very, very impactful. I think that the situation on the ground is obviously very difficult, but hearing that in statistics and also in personal stories, as you've shared, is very powerful. If people have questions, please do put them in the Q&A function below. So that's separate from the chat function. You can see it next to where it says participants on your screen. For those of you joining us from Facebook, you can also drop your question in the comments and we'll be monitoring that as well. We'll be happy to take a look at that. Since people are very quiet, and usually what happens is that no one asks questions for the first kind of 10 minutes of the Q&A, and then in the last 5 minutes we finally get a barrage of questions. How did you see the impact of the blockade on the mental health of Palestinian women intersectionally? So how did it impact women from various backgrounds in the Gaza Strip?
So I will say that most of the women that we interviewed came sort of the very marginalized areas within Gaza. So the very eastern, the very northern side. But I will say from other aspects of our work that we know specifically, whether it's people who have suffered from injuries during the Great March of Return, and here, I think roughly 30% of the women who participated in the Great March of Return, told us that they had sustained injuries during their participation from Israeli snipers. That we know that here, people who've sustained physical injuries are in some sort of very difficult bind in that any sort of prosthetics that are available in Gaza are very low level. And medical care, as I mentioned, is significantly lower quality than it is even in East Jerusalem, obviously much more so than in Israel. And at the same time, to access medical care in Israel, they require a medical exit permit. So again, it's sort of the ongoing sort of cycle of these women who are stuck in a situation where they are unable to get to the medical treatment they need. They have the impact of Israeli assaults, and they are unable to access the care of the level that they would actually need in order to have, I don't even want to say a sense of normality, but some sort of adequate functioning. So I don't know whether that's a full response.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I see that the questions are starting to trickle in. And I saw that Liz has also raised her hand, so I might just allow her to talk and ask her question directly if you'd like to do that, Liz. You're welcome to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right. Yes, I've actually also written the question, but I'll ask it verbally.
Yeah.
It's very short. Does Egypt contribute to trying to alleviate the situation for Gazans?
So it's sorry, I can hear myself echoing. It's a question that we often come across. And I will say this, we're an Israeli human rights organization. We look primarily at the impact of Israeli policymakers on human rights And as Stav mentioned, we work on the human rights of all vulnerable communities under the responsibility of the government of Israel. So it's obviously Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory, but it's also, individuals in incarceration in Israeli prisoners, whether Jewish or Palestinian, it's migrants, it's Israeli residents of the socio-geographic periphery, etc. So Egypt doesn't open the Rafah crossing as much as it should. However, our analysis, and that's one that's shared by most human rights organizations, is that Israel is an effective occupier of the Gaza Strip. There might not be boots on the ground, but you don't actually need boots on the ground in order to carry out an occupation, in that the level of control that Israel has over the daily life of Palestinians from Gaza, whether it's, allowing them to marry someone from East Jerusalem, or even, visit their mother who is unwell in the West Bank, or access medical care, as I mentioned, oncology treatment in a Palestinian hospital. All these things are regulated to the most minute aspect, and for that reason we hold Israel, who separates between Gaza and the sort of beating heart of Palestinian life, but also Palestinian medical system in East Jerusalem. We hold Israel as the main responsible actor here.
Thank you very much, Dana. We have another question from Brian on a similar note. Did the women attribute their trauma solely to Israel, or do they also attribute this to Hamas? Did you inquire into this?
So we didn't speak specifically about what Israel did or didn't do. We spoke about the human rights violations that they experienced. I think there are a lot of ways that Hamas also contributes to this, and we're not trying to whitewash this away. There are also things that are, in place in whatever context, whatever patriarchal context, whether it's domestic, that you might see across the world, including domestic abuse. But this isn't per se what the project focused on. The project was really focusing on what sort of human rights violations they experienced, and these women, mentioned the human rights violations themselves, from listening to drones, to medical exit permits, to, as I mentioned, injuries during the Brigade March of Return, and seeing, what is the impact of these human rights violations.
Thanks. And David asks, what was the thinking in creating the research study behind only interviewing women from the marginal areas of Gaza? And do you think that those women in the center of Gaza would have reflected Differently? And if I can add another question, because it's also about the kind of methodology of the research. Someone anonymously asked whether they understood correctly that women were selected from those attending a mental health service. And if so, then the numbers showing mental health problems is not surprising, and how much you think those issues are found. Do you think that these issues are found in the general population?
So these are all really good questions. The reality is that the Gaza Mental Health Community Program, has, community centers in these areas, because that is where the most need is. So we interviewed women from those areas. It's are women from central Gaza experienced impacted just as much? They might not experience the bombings of residential areas as directly, but they would experience the drones. They would, they would experience across the board, the violations in terms of, denials of medical exit permits. And it doesn't matter if you're in northern Gaza or southern Gaza or wherever. That's something that happens across the board, and it doesn't also matter how economically stable you are as a family. And I think one thing that we didn't really research specifically, but obviously has a mental health impact in Gaza, is the issue of poverty. You've got very, very high levels of unemployment, and within that you have the mental health impact of unemployment. And this is something that's, if you're looking at young people, then 70% of Palestinians in Gaza under 30 are unemployed, and a large proportion of that are university graduates. And this doesn't relate to marginal versus non-marginal areas, but it's more the reality of daily life in Gaza. And I think those aspects do translate into a mental health crisis wherever you're from. and I think, we're still talking about a relatively small area. So if I will not be impacted as an Israeli Jew the same way as an Israeli Jew from Sderot will be. But I might have family there, I might know people from there, and we're not necessarily talking about people who experience every single one of these violations firsthand, as we thought. In some cases, for example, the medical exit permits, we're talking about 30% of the women who experience this. But as with Israel, people know someone who knows someone, and they're talking about families that are very large, that are interlinked, and there's a mental health impact in seeing a member of your family become impacted. But of course, there are gradations. Same as an Israeli Jew from Tel Aviv might not have the same mental health crisis as someone from Sderot. Gaza is obviously much, much smaller, and the human rights violations are far more extensive and far deeper and impact a larger portion of the population, but there are gradations there.
Thank you. And I think you've just answered that, but Liz has asked whether there are any safe areas in Gaza during the bombing.
That's a really, really good question, and I didn't mention this, but unlike in Israel, there are no shelters in the same way, we have counterparts from the Gaza community mental health program sort of tell us, and I think here, you expect the mental health experts to sort of not have a different perspective, but at least be this safe place. But also the mental health experts that are supposed to assist people who are undergoing trauma, they themselves, might have seen their neighbors killed, might have been impacted in, dozens of ways from the Israeli blockade and periodic assaults. We're talking about, healthcare staff that treat patients who have PTSD, and the healthcare staff themselves have PTSD. There is really what came across from all the interviews, and we also had, in-depth interviews aside from a sort of our survey, is this feeling of pervasive fear that any moment, any moment there might be an assault or military operation, and at any given moment that puts you and your children and your family in extreme danger. Yeah, I think the thing with the reality is, there's no place to hide in Gaza, and the population obviously feels that.
Thanks, Dana. Rabbi Eli Tikvasara asks whether the women in Gaza have any women's organizations that advocate on their behalf, presumably specifically on women's rights issues rather than GCMHP.
Well, I think, that there's a sort of overlap there, obviously, because the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, obviously assists women, and some issues specifically affect women more than others. And there are obviously multiple Palestinian women's organizations. We at PHRI, we have a mobile clinic to Gaza. We're the only Israeli human rights organization that goes to Gaza, and we do that once a month with healthcare volunteers. And often we do that, together with local associations, including women's groups. And different women's groups advocate on different things, but of course, anything if oncology care to domestic abuse to sexual and reproductive health, these women's groups are there. Some are more active, some are less active. Some are able to operate more openly, some less.
Thanks, Dana. Judith wants to ask her question directly, so I'll just unmute her. Yeah, Judith, you can speak.
Hello. I'm asking, what can women do to help? That is, women in Israel, and I hold an Israeli passport, but can no longer be there. What can people do to help individual women?
Look, it's a really good question. I will say, there's a tendency to sort of go into more humanitarian answers, right? If only there were more mental health clinics, if only there were more, medical exit permits available, and all these things are very well and true. The problem is it's kind of, treating it with a plaster as opposed to the root problem. And the real problem is Israeli policies towards the Gaza Strip, including the blockade. So in terms of what to do, I think women in general have a lot of power, and I think the question is, how do you keep the conversation on Gaza going, right? Because as Stav mentioned, and I think I mentioned it too, there's a tendency to forget about Gaza when it's not in the headlines. And the second question is, how do you mainstream the conversation about mental health, in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and for Palestinians living within Israel? How do you get that conversation going? And I think there's a lot of power to each and every one of us, both based in the UK, but whether it's vis-a-vis your local MPs, or when you speak about mental health, or those of you who work in areas that intersect with mental health, but also in Israel right now, obviously we have the judicial overthrow. And here the focus is very much, on saving Israeli democracy. And a question that, I have and PHRI has is, how does democracy apply, and how can we use the term democracy in a situation of such long-standing apartheid? And, how can we continue having these conversations about the occupation and about, two very, separate and unequal health systems under the control of the Israeli government, within the larger conversation, of what's happening in Israel these days.
Thanks, Dana. And Brian has a follow-up question, which I think fits in quite nicely to what you were saying just now, and that's, how do you see your research influencing debate beyond those who are already concerned about these issues?
I really, really hope that we're not just speaking to those concerned. I think that would be a failure if we were. I'm not looking to, obviously I want to have these conversations and raise mental health within people who care about, Palestinian human rights and Palestinian and Israeli human rights. But I think that, for us, we're trying to expand this conversation to people who either who mainly don't care about mental health, but don't necessarily put the connection with Palestine. And I think what we at PHRI try to do is, a lot of our work involves, reaching out to the international medical community and reaching out to not the usual suspects, because the usual suspects are either aware, or if they're not aware, are, interested in actively learning, same as you, coming here or joining us on a Wednesday night. And so I think that it sort of relates to the question of that Judith had. And I think one of the ways in which we try and reach out to those who are not the usual suspects is through people who hear our message and are interested in taking it on, and taking it forward, like whoever joined us tonight.
Thanks, Dana. I think that's really powerful in showing, the impact that each and every one of us can have also after leaving this room, and, sharing some of what we've learned with our communities moving forward. There is space for questions, so keep them coming. It's really good to see that many people have asked lots of questions. We also have a comment in the chat that I'd like to share. Roselle said, thank you for explaining this so clearly, and that she now sees parallels with what she's learned from other organizations about, a system of control over the people in the occupied territories. And I wanted to kind of follow up on that, and also ask a question myself about, you mentioned the issues of the blockade in terms of really limiting, access to healthcare beyond the issues that we talked about in mental health in terms of Israeli operations in Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
And I in my Shirut Leumi, in my Israeli civil service, I volunteered in a hospital in East Jerusalem where we constantly had patients coming in from Gaza, often minors whose parents weren't given permission to actually come into the country. And I know that there are lots of organizations that do work on this, including Yachad, including other organizations of Israeli volunteers who support, the families of Gazans who are treated in Israel. And I just wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about the work that PHRI does specifically in those cases to advocate for these families and to help them.
Yeah, I think, I think when we speak about the impact of Israeli policies on Palestinians, I think the example of child separation is really one where you see it so very clearly in such a heartbreaking way. So as I mentioned, we've assisted over 180 children, or 180 families where the child needs to exit Gaza for a medical exit permit, but the parent, usually it's the mother, it's the mom that applies, doesn't get a permit to join them. And then the parents are in this really horrible situation where they have to either choose to try and, maybe the grandmother who's older might be able to, might be allowed to go with the child. So you either choose to have the grandmother or an aunt or even a more distant relative go with your child. And again, we're talking about, these are cases that have come into us, 4-year-old who needs chemo. Or you decide to reapply for a permit yourself and cross your fingers and hope that next time you'll be accepted. But then that means delaying or postponing your child's medical care, which they so badly need. So it's really, the sort of really tears families apart from what we see. And in terms of the actual work that we do to help them, we write to COGAT, to the coordinator of government activities in the territories, to the military unit that's in charge of permits. A lot of our work is with the Israeli public. And so, we try and get stories in the Israeli media. We try and submit pre-petitions, sometimes legal petitions, and we have a success rate of overturning Israeli army decisions in at least 50% of the cases. That's from the 180 cases that I mentioned. And when we speak about Israeli control over Palestinian lives, we really see how arbitrary Israeli arguments about security can be. Because if all it took from us is to publish a story in Yediot Achronot or in Haaretz about a child that's being, treated in hospital, whatever, 100 of kilometers away from his mother, and that's what it takes is for that article to appear, for the mother to suddenly be able to join her child, then how much of a security reason was that for the denial in the first place? So this is, both in terms of the work we do, but also in terms of, the impact it has. And this is something work that we've been working on for a while. Obviously, we're only able to get to the tip of the iceberg, but a lot of the work we do is about exposing unjust policies. And we ourselves sort of initiated a conversation in the Knesset to discuss this issue. And during this conversation, an Israeli military spokesperson told us that in 2020, 4 out of 10 or 40% of children in Gaza who exited for medical care were not able to exit with their parents. That's insane. That's 4 out of every 10 children. And again, as I mentioned, the cases we have is anything from breastfeeding babies to 16-year-olds undergoing chemo, surgery, and the cases I've mentioned are whether we've had cases where the grandmother accompanies the grandchild because the mother is not allowed to. We had one case where the grandmother was then hospitalized as well while she was taking care of her grandchild, and so they were in different wings. We had a case of a 9-year-old who actually lived with his father, which is relatively rare in Gaza, and the father did not get a permit to go, and he was not able to secure a permit from anyone else, and basically asked someone from the community, not a relative, who was going anyway across areas, crossing, to take the child with her. The child had epilepsy. On the way there, the child had an epileptic fit, and the woman said that she was too scared to take him by herself. And we're talking about very, very, very heartbreaking cases, and it really is a sort of very much a sort of small. Each time is a small drama of you see the dynamics of the way in which Israeli oppressive policies impact every aspect of Palestinian life.
Thanks very much, Dana. I think that's really powerful. And I think these case studies are really heartbreaking because, it's making something that anyways would be really difficult for anyone to have a child who is sick, or a child who is sick and has to be treated in a context of a culture that they don't understand, a language that they often don't understand, right? It's people who they often see as their enemies, or who have bombed family members and so on. And then adding all of these restrictions to that. And Judith, I see you have your hand up, but Rabbi,
may I just add something? The vast majority of these cases are actually treated in Palestinian hospitals because the Israeli authorities, despite contributing and leading the development of the Palestinian healthcare system due to a wide variety of policies from tax money freeze to land expropriation, the Palestinian Authority has to pay for medical treatment when it sends patients to Israel. So in general, these patients are being treated in Palestinian hospitals. And the irony is then that they can't even access Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem. It's not even that they're trying to get to Israeli hospitals in many of the cases, though of course in some, no treatment is available in the Palestinian hospitals themselves. So they do have to access Israeli hospitals, and Israel charges high prices for that.
Thank you. That's a really helpful clarification. Judith, before I move on to you, I see that Rabbi Ali has a follow-up question from this topic, so I think it will make sense to continue with that. And Rabbi Ali asks, do the Israeli authorities offer explanations for refusing permits to parents whose children require medical care? And if they do, what reasons do they give?
It's very, very, very rare for any sort of explanation beyond denied for security reasons. I will say sometimes, it's not even that they're outright denied, they're just left unanswered. And then, the way in which you apply for a medical exit permit is you need a hospital appointment to apply. And then you need at least 23 days, according to Israeli army regulations, to apply, or 23 or 21, I can't quite remember. So if you miss your hospital appointment, you have to again reapply, and it takes the whole process again and again. But there's no transparency, and there's no way to really appeal that in any sort of active way.
Thanks, Dana. And Judith, I'm sorry, we have another follow-up question on this very topic. So Liz is asking, are there any volunteers who will try to care for unaccompanied children?
There are organizations that sort of send people to Al-Maqasid or Augusta Victoria Hospital. But yeah, I think, it's not quite the same for a child as having their parent with them. In general, I don't think there is really organizations that do this, but there might be. It's just they're not particularly active in Palestinian hospitals in East Jerusalem for obvious reasons.
Thanks. I know there's some organizations that help, right, with car rides and so on.
Yes. There's Road to Recovery, which also helps take patients from areas to Palestinian hospitals, but they're not necessarily the people who will come and comfort your child when they're crying while getting treated.
Yeah, thanks. Judith, I've asked you to unmute, but I'll just ask another question, but if you'd like to unmute, then you're very welcome to ask another follow-up question after that. Dana, you mentioned, that the tendency to want to kind of make plaster interventions and not change the structural issues that are at stake. And we were talking about, the wider implications of the border restrictions, for example. And so I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about the structural changes that you think needs to happen, especially in terms of, the Gaza Strip being occupied. And that's something that I think many people don't know the historical kind of trajectory of, and the responsibilities of Israel towards Gaza as an occupied territory. I think you touched on that a lot of times during the things that you've said, but it would be nice to go a little bit more in depth into that.
Of course. I think, I think that the main impact, the thing that would have the most impact is to have the blockade be lifted, so that younger Palestinians living in Gaza would have the same experience as, their parents of, being able to travel more freely. I think that, that is the most significant aspect, because it impacts every aspect of daily life, from, what drugs and medications can come in, to employment, to import and export, and employment opportunities arising from that. And if you look back at the story of T that I mentioned in the beginning, her husband was able to pay for a house in 2008 because he had employment in Israel, and then permits became very, very, very. But then there were permits that were very, very strict, and then that economic avenue was no longer available to him, and now we have massive grinding poverty in Gaza. So I think, the most significant aspect is lifting the blockade of Gaza, and I think there's often when we speak about the Israeli government and the occupation, it's easy to forget about Gaza because it's not. There are no boots on the ground, but still the way we see it, and there's an international legal consensus on this, there's an effective occupation because of the extent of control of Israel on Gaza. And I think how to tackle that is to end this extensive control. I understand that this is something, for us, this is a demand that must be mainstreamed into all conversations on Palestinian human rights. But, then there's sort of more, is there, bearing in mind that we're able to overturn at least 50% of the medical exit permits, does there need to be a medical exit permit regime in the same way? This is something that the various UN committees have said, and obviously this according to the sort of medical ethics guidelines, but patients should have speedy and free access to medical care. They shouldn't be prevented from accessing chemo or surgery or whatever other medical care is available. Same as like you wouldn't be prevented from traveling to Brighton to go to a doctor. And I'm not trying to sort of be superficial here. Really, we're talking about the same sort of structures in place. And so when we speak about what would make a difference, then obviously the blockade is one, but when we speak about human rights violations, then the medical exit permit, when the permit regime is responsible for quite a few violations that we see on the ground.
Thanks very much, Dana. I see that Naomi has a comment that she'd like to share, and after that we might have time for one final question before we wrap things up. So Naomi, you're able to unmute now if you want.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, somebody asked whether there are groups that provide support to children or in fact adults when they're in hospital in Israel or in East Jerusalem. And I do know of at least one. I'm speaking from the British Shalom Salam Trust. And we fund an Israeli group called Humans Without Borders. And they provide a free, what you might call taxi service to patients who need to get across from Gaza. And they don't just provide a taxi service, they make friends with the patients, they go visit them. If it's a child, they will go make sure the child is all right, that they've got toys, that they've got entertainment. They told us about one case where they couldn't get either of the parents or the grandmother. There was nobody they would allow to go except a 14-year-old who was the baby's uncle. And he was just under the age where he would be forbidden to travel, so he was allowed to go. And there he was stuck in this hospital, not allowed to go anywhere outside the confines of the hospital wing where the baby was being kept. And on their first visit, they discovered he was quietly going out of his mind. He didn't know where to be. He had no idea what to do. So they made friends with him and they looked after him. And various other volunteers from Humans Without Borders went into the hospital and played with the baby. So it's a tiny thing, but they are rather wonderful. And if anyone does, I'm going to make a plea here. If anyone wants to do something practical, spread the word about that organisation and help us to support them. And I'd like to be abused this time to say something else. The biggest thing we can do here, somebody asked you, Dana, what can we do here? That's a bit difficult for you to answer because we're here and you're not. The biggest thing we can do here is try to persuade people in the Jewish community to confront what's going on and to start saying, we don't want this to happen in our name. And it doesn't, you can still love Israel if you want to love Israel, if you feel like that. But it has to be wrong that women die from breast cancer because they can't get through for treatment, and that they can't get the treatment in Gaza because they can't get the medicines or whatever is necessary. It has to be wrong that babies are sent in taxis on their own or with a 14-year-old uncle. And I just do not believe that if most Jewish people here knew that that was going on and were willing to talk about it, that they wouldn't actually want us to say, this is not acceptable. So sorry to have abused this a bit, but I think this is a very
No, I think it's very important that you say this, and I really do think that each of us has the power, whether it's vis-a-vis the Jewish community, or your MPs, or whatever platform you think is the right one to advocate for this. But I think that for us, we try and use a combination of personal stories and data on the ground to sort of show the impact of Israeli policies. And yes, I do think that there needs to be more of an understanding of what's going on the ground in the international community, and the need to sort of say, where does this stop, right? There's been so many justifications for Israeli policies, but I think the tide is starting to shift, but there needs to be a very clear red line about continuing this and allowing this to continue. And I think each of us has a personal responsibility to stand up during this time when our message is more likely to be heard, to emphasize that red line.
Thank you very much, Dana, and thank you, Naomi, for that intervention. I think that was very, very powerful, and I think that this is kind of the perfect, powerful note to end on. Really appreciate all of you taking the time this evening to come here and to ask your questions, and to Dana again for your presentation. We know that it's a very difficult and hectic time, and that PHRI has had a lot to deal with in recent weeks, and we appreciate you taking this evening at what is it, 9 p.m. now in Israel to speak to us. I'd just like to plug kind of before we finish, if you do want to continue this conversation in your synagogues, we're going to be launching a synagogue speaker series soon, where we'll be bringing Palestinian and Israeli speakers at the forefront of this work, like Dana, doing this work to shuls across the country. And so if you're interested in doing that, in bringing that to your synagogue, feel free to reach out afterwards. We also find that the most impactful way to really engage with these issues is to meet people engaged in this work firsthand, which is why we host trips to the region every year, and we have an upcoming one in November. So I've just sent you all the link to that. I really recommend it, as an Israeli, going on one of those trips, meeting people firsthand, being able to go to places that I normally wouldn't have access to anyways, like the military courts, talking to diplomats and so on, is a really powerful experience and a way to learn about everything that's going on. I see, Dana, that you've also shared your email in the chat. Would you like to add any closing remarks as well?
No, I'd say that please feel free, if you're interested to learn more about PHRI's work and what you can do, then please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue this conversation on the health of vulnerable communities in Israel and the OPT, and also on Palestinian mental health. And thank you all for who joined us tonight.
Thank you very much, Dana, and we will be sharing the executive report with everyone as well, so you can read more. Thanks again, Dana. Really appreciate your time, and thank you, everyone. Hope you have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye. Good night.
Bye.